Now we're going to move on to pivot tables. Pivot tables are like sorting and filtering on steroids. It makes it so easy to visually slice and dice your data and analyze different relationships to answer questions that you might have so that you can come up with insights that help you make better decisions. Just like sorting and filtering, you can either select your dataset or just make sure that your cell cursor is inside your dataset and then hit Alt-N for insert and V for pivot table. Excel pops up this Create Pivot Table box, and it should automatically select the range of your data. The only other thing that you need to worry about here is whether you want to insert your pivot table into an existing worksheet or if you want to create a new worksheet. If I wanted, I could put my pivot table on this worksheet that I have right here, but I prefer to separate them into their own, so I'm just going to leave this option, add new worksheet, and hit enter. Now Excel creates this new worksheet, and it gives me this blank pivot table box. This is essentially your blank canvas for constructing your pivot table. As you drag these fields into the 4 quadrants below, your pivot table starts to take shape. So let's say that we want to look at this syndicated debt data to analyze differences in investor behavior from deal to deal. I'm going to start by clicking and dragging this investor field down to my rows quadrant. And when I do that, the pivot table will populate my 5 investors. I know that one of the factors that influences investors' decisions to commit or decline to a transaction is the tier that they're invited to participate at, if they're a book runner or if they're a participant. So maybe I want to take that invite tier and then put that in my columns quadrant. So now I have column labels for book runner and participant, but the area underneath is blank. That's because I need to tell Excel which values that I want to look at. The thing that I care about is whether my investor committed to the deal that they were invited to, or if they declined, and I want to know if that behavior changes if they're invited as a book runner or if they're invited as a participant. I think that it is, and I'm curious to see if that changes from bank to bank. You populate your pivot table with data with this values quadrant, so I'm going to take my commit field, where my data tells me if the investor committed or declined, and I'm going to drag that to my values quadrant, and when I let go, you'll see that it's now populated with data. The problem is that the number that you see here is just the count of rows of data that fit each of these criteria. You'll see right here in the values quadrant, it says count of commit. The reason for that is if we look back at our original data set, our commit column right here contains the word commit or the word decline. So essentially, it's just giving us 2 categories. So that commit field is text that gives us 2 categories. If I were to remove this commit field by dragging it back, I could take something like the investor's fee share and drag it into values, and because that's a numerical feature, Excel treats it differently. You'll see that this is the sum of the fee share. So for each of Bank of America's deals where they were a book runner, this is the sum of all of the fees in the dataset that they collected. I could go over here to my values quadrant, I could click on some of fee share, and then I could click on this value field setting, and I could change that to give me the count, which will just tell me how many transactions Bank of America was invited to. I could look at their average fee when they're invited as a book runner and a participant. So that might be useful, but that's not what I want. So I'm going to take this and drag it back, and I'm going to get commit one more time and drag that down to values. So what I want to do here is I want to split this number into commits and declines. I know that Bank of America was invited to 159 transactions as a book runner. What I want to know is out of those 159 transactions, how many did they commit to and how many did they decline to participate in? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert sub-rows beneath each of my investors. I'm going to use my pivot table so that underneath Bank of America, there's a second row that says commit, and then a row beneath that that says decline. And then you'll see Deutsche Bank, there will be a commit and there will be a decline, and so on. The way that I do that is I go up here to my commit feature, and then I drag that down to my rows quadrant. And when I let that go, you'll now see that my data has been split into the 2 categories. This works for my commit feature because there are only 2 possible categories in the commit feature. If I were to take commit back and remove it from my rows, and then take something like the close date of the deal and drag it down here, now this gets kind of crazy because I have so many different options in that closed deal data feature. Even though Excel's grouped it by year, this still becomes pretty overwhelming and not super useful because there are so many different alternatives. Now I'm going to go back to my rows. I'm going to remove years, I'm going to remove quarters, and close date. So Excel just automatically populated years and quarters because it recognized that that's a date. And I'm going to take commit and drag it down here. And you'll see that because this is only 2 categories, it's a lot more useful and readable. And this is actually giving us some useful information now. I can look and see Bank of America was invited to 159 transactions as a book runner and 49 transactions as a participant. When they're invited as a book runner, they committed to 149 of those deals and they declined only 10. But if you look at where they are invited as a participant, they committed to only 22 and they actually declined the majority. They declined 27 out of those participant invitations. So this tells me that clearly Bank of America does not like being invited as a participant as much as they like it being invited as a book runner. It's even more severe when you go down to Deutsche Bank. You'll see that they commit to almost none of their participant invitations. They decline almost all of them. But now this gets interesting. If I go down to Wells Fargo, you'll see that they commit overwhelmingly to their book runner invitations, but they also commit to the majority of their participant invitations. So using a pivot table to arrive at this insight could be useful for me if I'm somebody that's inviting different investors to participate in a transaction. If I need a bank that's going to be a participant and that's not going to decline the deal, I might want to go to Wells Fargo. There are a lot of different features that you can use to customize your pivot tables. For example, you'll see that there are these subtotal lines for each of our banks. I might want to remove that so that I can make this a little less busy and a little more readable. And to do that, I need to make sure that my cell cursor is in my pivot table, and then I'll hit Alt J Y to get to this design tab that only pops up when I'm looking at a pivot table. There are a lot of options that you can play with here to customize your pivot table, and the one that we're going to go to now is subtotal. So I'm going to hit T, and then I'm going to hit D, and you'll see that my subtotals have disappeared, so now this is even more readable. Let's take a look at a slightly different slice of this data so that we can look at a few more pivot table features. I still want to look at my commit, so I'm going to leave count of commit in my values. And I want to see, obviously, commit versus decline, so I'm going to leave investor and commit my rows. What I'm going to remove is invite tier from my columns. And now I'm going to pull my rating into my columns. Now, this field describes the corporate credit rating for each of the borrowers in these transactions. Obviously, corporate credit ratings usually use letters. That's been converted into numbers for this data set. In this case, 10 means that the company has a higher credit rating and they're very secure and stable, and 1 means that the company is highly leveraged and riskier. So by looking at this data, you can get a sense for the risk tolerance of these different investors, which also might be a useful piece of information. What might be useful, though, is if I could create some buckets for my credit ratings. A credit rating of 2 is not that different than 1, 3 is not that different than 2, 9 is not that different than 10. So what I can do is right-click up here and group these categories together. So if I go down here to group, I can say that I want to start at 1, end at 10, and let's say I want buckets of 3. So Excel is now going to create a bucket of 1 to 3, a bucket of 4, 5, and 6. And since obviously 10 isn't evenly divisible by 3, it's going to give me 7, 8, 9, and 10 in its own bucket. So now I can see that Bank of America commits to a higher proportion of these leveraged deals versus the more stable investment grade deals. Let's remove our count of commit from this values quadrant and take a look at the fee share for each of these banks. So this represents the sum of all of the fees that these banks get and all of the transactions in each of these categories. So for example, this tells us that corporations that fall in the ratings bucket of 1 to 3 have paid Bank of America $1.4 billion in fees, and the Bank of America has missed out on about $100 million of fees for deals they've declined in that ratings category. What's really cool about this is we can actually change the way these fees are displayed so that we can see it as a percentage, which might give us some more useful information. So I'm going to go down here to where it says sum of fee share, and I'm going to click that and hit value field settings. Now, we already know that we can change this to the count, the average, the max, but what we haven't looked at is this show values as tab. So I'm going to click that. And here, if I go to where it says no calculation, I can change this to a percentage of the grand total, which will tell me the percentage of fees that Bank of America has collected out of all of the fees in my whole data set. Or what might be really useful here is the percentage of my row total. So if I hit OK, what this is telling me now is that out of all of Bank of America's commits in this row right here, 43% of the fees that they earn are in this lower ratings category. 22% of the fees that they earn are in this middle ratings category, and then 34% is in this higher ratings category. So what that tells me is that this is the most profitable ratings segment for Bank of America. So as I look, this is pretty consistent. Deutsche Bank is making about the same amount of fees from their lower segment and their higher segment, and Goldman Sachs too. But MUFG Union and Wells Fargo are also both making the majority of their fees from this more leveraged rating segment. Another really cool feature about pivot tables is how easy it makes it to visualize these relationships in your data. If you hit Alt and then JT to go to this new Pivot Table Analyze tab, on the far right you'll see the option Pivot Chart. I'm going to hit C, And Excel is going to suggest a type of chart for me to use based on the data. I'm going to hit enter. And you'll see that this makes it pretty easy to visualize the data in my pivot table. For example, I can see this big blue bar in Deutsche Bank for their declines. This tells me that out of all of the fees that Deutsche could earn from their decline transactions, 70% of the fees that they're missing out on are from those lower-rated, more leveraged companies. So if Deutsche Bank were to make a strategic decision to support more of these leveraged deals with their capital, they could capture 70% of that lost revenue. Because this is a pivot table, it's actually a little bit more dynamic than a normal table. I can go over here, I can click on the different labels, and I could exclude these lower rated transactions if I wanted. Or let's go back and include those again. Let's say that I only wanted to look at the deals where investors committed. I don't care about where they declined. So now I can clean up this visual so that it's easier to read. Pivot charts are a super valuable way to visualize your data, especially when you're presenting to people that you work with and your clients. And I hope that through this lesson, you've gained a little bit of an appreciation for how powerful pivot tables are and how useful they can be when you're analyzing large data sets.